Thank you very much, Annette. That was very interesting. Our next speaker is Richard Crabtree, who is Partnerships Policy Lead Reform Program for GBR. Richard comes with a professional base as a chartered town planner, is a broad range of skills and experience with the interest in institutional relationships, providing strategic advice and strategic development, experienced across the public and private sectors, and the interface between these. He's finding opportunities for improving outcomes. The current focus is on how GBR responds to the most ambitious mayoral transport authorities and the north of England, working across local partners, rail industry, DFT, and urban transport groups. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Annette.
Please. Oh.
Good morning. Now, just make sure you can hear me. Just bear with me. Just a moment. Hello. You can definitely hear me now. I can hear me. Thank you for that introduction, Mona. So yes, good morning. I am Richard Crabtree. Thank you for having me. I'm here to give you an update on the rail reform programme. We're at an interesting pivot point in overall terms. So as set out, I'm the policy lead for kind of that mouthful of an introduction. I'm sorry that we gave you that. That's a real challenge. Ultimately, I'm the policy lead for mayoral partnerships as part of the rail reform programme. Like most people working in the rail reform programme, I am a secondee. We're part of the teams that used to be called Great British Railways Transition Team. GBRTT is now concluded as a departmental arm's length body. And that marks a shift, actually. I think this is the important point. It marks a shift now to rail reform starting to become something that's actually happening. I'm a secondee, actually, as it happens, from the local government sector, from West Yorkshire Combined Authority. And as such, I'm in a very unfamiliar territory here because I am, as you said, a public policy professional from local government. But I think, nonetheless, I can give you a good update. So yes, our teams are now actually hosted in Network Rail within what's called system operator, but we're not formally part of the system operator function. So the mission for rail reform is fundamentally a very simple one, a simpler, better railway for everyone. That will ultimately lead to the creation of an integrated public body called Great British Railways, and I suspect most of you are familiar with that. Underpinning the mission is to unlock potential for change by uniting track and train. That is the crucial point. It's been a theme that's run through the reform programme all the time, and crucially, uniting track and train behind shared goal and shared purpose. And I think that therein lies some of the opportunities in the shorter terms. Driving collaboration across industry is now considered essential to address operational bottlenecks, to improve infrastructure, and ultimately to deliver for passengers and freight customers. There are many great examples of the benefits on offer when industry does work together. You have plenty from your own areas of practice, creating those conditions for success. And what rail reform needs to do is make that the norm, and not only to deliver for passengers, but also to ensure the industry is far more effective and accountable for what it's doing on behalf of the nation. Reform is encouraging people to embrace change, drive innovation, and to challenge the status quo wherever possible. And in so doing, it certainly require ambition from everybody involved. And there's one thing I've noticed and can reflect, having come into the rail industry space from outside it. There's so much enthusiasm to do the right thing in the rail industry, and that is a very special quality. No one's out to cause problems. And that really, for me personally, certainly looking in, seeing in the industry, see the huge opportunity that reform can offer to do things better. So the program will ultimately take years to implement, and the moment that GBR is formally established is just one step on that reform journey. That's why I think it's important now to see reform as something that's already happening. The formation of GBR is just one moment in that, and once GBR is in place, the reform will continue to take place. And today's theme is behaviour and behaviour change. And goodness me, rail reform is one huge change programme, ultimately. So government published its policy position on rail reform in February, a railway fit for Britain's future. That acts as both a policy position update, following on from the Labour government's following from the manifesto commitments set out in Get Britain Moving, which was published in April last year. It also is a consultation document ahead of legislation due to come to Parliament later this year, the Railways, excuse me, the Railways Bill. Crucially, I think this is one of the key differences, as you'll be aware, it positions GBR as a directing mind for the railway, bringing together both train operations and the infrastructure into public ownership. A railway fit for Britain's future, as the document's called, sets out 6 clear objectives for the railway of the future, set out there. I'll briefly run through those. So the first is reliable, and reliability of the railway, as you know, is one of the first priorities for the reform programme. It's what passengers and freight customers are expecting from the railway, almost above all else. Reliable so that people can have confidence in their journey, whether one-off day trip or daily commuting. Affordable so that prices are kept wherever possible at points that works for passengers and taxpayers. Efficient, self-evidently, so that people know that the journey will be as straightforward as possible from booking to travel, and to better provide value for travelling public and the taxpayer alike. Quality, so that passengers have the service experience they have the right to expect. Accessibility, a very high political priority, so that rail is available for everyone to use. And safe, so that people don't worry about the safety on the railway and are not in fear of accidents or the fear of crime as they go on. So if anyone has not yet referred to a railway fit for its future, it is worth having a look. It is a good summary of where government stands on the reform programme. And the consultation remains open until Tuesday next week. And there's a series of consultation questions set out there. And I suspect the institution and others will be possibly submitting a response. So it has been quite a journey. I don't think there's any denying that. You'll know the origins of rail reform with the Williams Rail Review, which was triggered by fundamentally by the timetable crises back in May 2018. The diagnoses of the problems that drive rail reform have been consistent throughout, and it's now a matter of consensus that an overly fragmented industry structure, poor alignment of objectives, and a lack of accountability have driven the negative outcomes that have led to the obvious need for reform. So if we pick up the journey from the general election in July 2014, the government moved quickly to bring in legislation onto the books to enable public ownership of passenger operations. What that legislation has done, the Public Ownership Bill, as we call it on this slide, has removed the presumption for private operation of individual operators. Excuse me. That's marked the creation of the DFT operator, is it called, DFTO, led by Robin Gisby. It used to be what was once called the operator of last resort. Now it is the body that is leading the public ownership programme, at the natural points in individual rail contracts, where those contracts end, they will come into the public sector under DFTO's guardianship and leadership, pending the wider reform programme, but also to start realising opportunities for change. And the first operator that will come into the public sector under that programme is South Western Railway, and that takes place next month. The Railways Bill, subject to the current consultation, is due to be introduced into Parliament over the summer. That will pass the parliamentary process, and that will ultimately pave the way for the fundamental industry structural reform set out in the consultation, with a working assumption, and it is just that, that GBR will be formally stood up in 2027. But meanwhile, the Secretary of State is clear, and I think, as I'm hoping to articulate today, that reform can't wait for these moments, and in particular, it can't wait for the stand-up of GBR as a binary moment. So the Secretary of State has made clear that the benefits of reform need to start now, and that is where we get this concept of Shadow Great British Railways, or SGBR. And that is a coming together of DFT operator, or DFTO, under Robin Gisber's leadership, Network Rail, as you know, under Andrew Haynes' leadership, and those parts of the department which will transfer into the rail industry, currently under Alex Haynes' leadership. And those three people coming together on a regular basis as the Shadow GBR group, under the chair of Laura Schoaf. Laura Schoaf was appointed as Shadow GBR chair in autumn. That group is meeting on a regular basis, and increasingly the governance around that group is being formalised. Excuse me, can I just grab a water? Thank you. Excuse me. So, in January, the Secretary of State issued Shadow GBR's leadership with 4 focus areas. Oh, fantastic, thank you. These are integration, so finding ways to integrate track and train as soon as possible, and using particularly the opportunity of bringing operators into the public sector to find new ways of doing things. And I'll talk about the opportunity that alliancing brings in that space shortly. And I think you'll see that as being one of the main opportunities over the next 18 months, 2 years. Shared standards, and by which I mean aligning particularly performance measures, and you'll be familiar, many of you already, of the drive now to bring in shared standards across the infrastructure and operators to align performance incentives. As I said before, one of the big challenges identified by the drivers for the need for reform was this misalignment of objectives and performance indicators. Reforming fares and ticketing, and work has already started on that. You'll be aware of some of the fares and ticketing trials. There's trials soon on barcode, pay-as-you-go initiatives. There's a multimodal pay-as-you-go being promoted here in Greater Manchester with TFGM. Similarly, an initiative in West Midlands, and trials also in, I should say, the further rollout of smart ticketing in the southeast. And again, hopefully, as more operators come into the public sector, the opportunity to take a far more flexible approach to marketing fares and so forth. And you'll have seen the rail sales, which are demonstrating actually the ability to grow the market through smart joined up marketing. Innovation, and some of the examples, excuse me, that Annette's provided show the way that the innovation is being promoted to deliver benefits to performance, social and environmental value. So to say more about the reform achievements so far, including the work of Great British Railways. I won't go through all these in detail, you'll be glad to know, but this is a smorgasbord of the things that the rail reform programme has been doing over recent years. I'll focus in on, let's say, 3 of these to give you a taster. I think the first and an important one, because of the opportunity and the need to grow the industry's revenue, is the initiatives to grow revenue. GBRTT collaborated across industry and particularly through Rail Delivery Group to earn more than £100 million in additional revenue. So you've seen the industry started to do collective marketing. Now, what is the term? Nothing beats being there. You'll have seen those adverts using prominently the double arrow to market the industry as a whole. The research is showing that those kind of campaigns are really generating revenue as you'd hope they would. Excuse me. And so Book with Confidence and the 2 Great British Rail sales. Those 2 Great British Rail sales have shown a huge return on the investment made on the discounted ticketing. It's grown the market. It's got people back into rail, and it's showing the opportunity in really clear terms to grow the rail's revenue beyond the markets it's currently serving, which is, like I say, crucial to the future finances. And then industry financial model. You'll see possibly last year Roger Ford did an interesting piece on this work in Modern Railways magazine. What the industry financial model does, and some colleagues will possibly be familiar with it, is it's taking a whole industry view of finances down to a reasonably fine grain in the network, looking both at passenger income and operating costs from the operator side, as well as infrastructure costs and operating and the opportunity there is to find more integrated decision making across track and train as a forerunner and as one of the tools that will be needed to achieve properly integrated decision making across track and train in the future, which is so crucial to delivering the benefits of reform. And then simplifying track and train. GBR have been working with government and industry partners to consider how to bring together the system of rail that's led to GBRTT facilitating track and train coming together in Anglia, and that's provided some of the forums both for the Simplification Commission that you saw, so trying to reduce the bureaucracy, and there's a lot of bureaucracy in the industry, as you know, around station change in particular, and made recommendations in that space, and some of the lighter touch alliancing that's been happening with Anglia, which is now feeding the more formal alliance proposals that have been announced both for South Eastern and South Western Railway to come once that comes into public sector ownership. Just to say a tad more about that alliancing, what the alliancing will do is bring together the management from the publicly owned rail operators and the Network Rail routes with a common management team under a managing director. The managing director's first 2 alliances have been announced in the last week to really drive that alignment of incentives and objectives and start to take quite a different approach to things like, relevant to this audience, things like planning possessions, that sort of thing, and putting aside the typical penalties and constraints that have contractual constraints that might otherwise have prevented that sort of thing from happening. So into my natural space, also in parallel, the English Devolution White Paper was published late last year. That sets out a growing role for mayoral combined authorities, in future to be known as mayoral strategic authorities, with a statutory role to produce local growth plans, local transport plans and spatial development strategies. What does that mean for rail, though? So that white paper, which will be followed up with legislation also this year. And we've heard now about 3 different bits of legislation across 2 speakers, which demonstrates quite what a busy legislative programme this government ultimately has. Promises a statutory role for mayors in rail, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But crucially, devolution by default. Devolution was a competitive process under the last government. Different places competed with each other to secure powers. The new policy is now one of devolving powers increasingly by default. Crucially, what we're seeking, and what government's seeking to do, is make it a much more natural thing for mayoral authorities to invest in the rail network. There are examples of it already, but in order to drive their local growth plans, their local growth visions, and ultimately to deliver their local transport plans, facilitating partnering and investing in the railway. And I think that's probably the most important bit here. And that requires ultimately making the railway much easier to do business with. And speaking as someone from a combined authority myself, that's always been a challenge with the railway. Those of you working in the industry see it as complex. And you know, there are people who make careers about understanding the complexity. If you're an outside body, like a combined authority, seeking to invest in railway outcomes, there's such a huge opportunity through the reform programme to simplify those external relationships, and in so doing make the railway far more responsive to places. For those most ambitious places, we're discussing the opportunity for commissioning partnership, and that and Manchester in particular is an area that I think is keen to work through this with us, how a mayoral authority can start to commission local railway outputs from the railway. Fundamentally, is an alternative to the sort of model pursued by Liverpool City Region with Merseyrail Electrics and so forth, and preventing this pursuit of the carve-outs. I will canter through these remaining slides. This really is a reminder of the breadth of railway, and in particular that rail reform isn't just about the formation of Great British Railways as an entity. It is a whole sector transformation. It's a different regulatory process, a substantially changed role, for example, for the Office of Road and Rail, ORR. Proposals for a new voice for passengers, a passenger watchdog, to independently monitor standards and champion investment. Crucially, and I think this is one of the things that a lot of people were waiting for the announcement in February to see confirmation of, GBR will manage access to the network. In so doing, that is how it will act as the guiding mind, and there'll be a keenly watched access and use policy which will set the rules of the game on how network capacity is allocated in the most fair way. And as you can imagine, and rightly, the freight industry is watching that keenly, which is a good moment to mention some of the opportunities. And I've mentioned the opportunity around raising revenues. I haven't talked a lot about Rail Campus Derby, but the proposal for the GBR HQ in Derby remains, and that's an important project for the East Midlands and for Derby City. The freight growth target of at least 75% freight growth carried by rail by 2050 remains, and that will be hardwired into GBR, and I think that's an important factor for the freight community. And realising what's been identified as a £1 billion growth opportunity, unconstrained revenue growth opportunity, by making rail easier, improving access to and from rail, reducing the friction in ticket purchasing and so forth. But still, crucially, 45% of the expenditure in rail is expected to happen with private sector partners. So this isn't about GBR necessarily in-housing everything. Private sector supply chains also have a fundamentally important role to play. Benefits for infrastructure. I won't dwell on this because you, as an audience, are probably best placed to know what the benefits for the infrastructure are. But the obvious examples are around more effective roles, more effective approaches to access, more efficient productivity, joining up maintenance work, decision-making across the operators and the infrastructure management, holistic views, open data in particular. There's a really important point about making data as open as possible and open by default. And Network Rail actually has a good track record, I think, in that space. And hopefully a longer term view as well, both in terms of longer term planning, certainly, and creating some certainty on horizons, although I think fundamentally the 5-year settlements will remain. So the vision for GBR, I will conclude by saying there's still a lot of things we don't know about GBR. I think the most important thing now is to get it established. The moment GBR is established and it becomes a thinking thing with a board and a chair and a chief executive, I think that really starts unlocking potential. We don't want to wait for that, though. It will be simpler and better. It will be an arm's length body from ministers with independence to make customer planning and operating decisions at a local level. It will be required to balance commercial, economic and social and other objectives in line with very clear duties set by Secretary of State. It will bring costs and revenues together and have a long-term system-wide perspective. And it will work to a long-term strategy for transport, ensuring transport infrastructure can be driven efficiently and on time. And again, you see the themes from particularly that NIC work that Annette mentioned. Decentralized organisation, empowered and outward facing, with local business units working with devolved leaders to make sure rail is responding to the needs of places. Track and train, planned and operated jointly to deliver commercial and public interest objectives, and a new entity with a new approach and a distinct identity. And to conclude, all I will say is thank you. Say change starts now. You are all part of that change. We are all part of that change. And really, at this point, we need to stop thinking of GBR as something else, but we are all GBR. And on that note, I will conclude, and thank you.